And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a storm moving rapidly up across the Queen Charlotte Islands here on into British Columbia. Going to be close enough to keep steady rain going over the southern panhandle, and lighter amounts of rain with this trough over the northern southeast coast to Yakutat back in toward Prince William Sound. Area precipitation coming across the Kenai Peninsula into Cook Inlet. Madanuska-Susitna Valley overnight tonight with some areas receiving a couple inches of snow. And a widespread area of snow here from the western Alaska Range right up into the central interior areas on up to the mid and upper Yukon River over toward Eagle. And another area of light snow for the Arctic coast and North Slope continuing. That'll extend down in toward the Bering Strait and to St. Lawrence Island. Next big storm here coming onto the chart tonight, bringing wind and rain into the eastern Aleutians, lifting northward tomorrow. And strong winds, Alaska Peninsula, gale force and storm force winds all around this center with strong gusts possibly to 80 miles an hour in the Alaska Peninsula. Rain and wind pushing into Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay. Otherwise, not too bad over the interior by comparison. And still a little on the damp side here for the central and southern southeast coast. And then for Tuesday, big storm here moving into the eastern Bering Sea, southeast Bering Sea, Bristol Bay area. Strong winds all across the southern half of the state, and actually pretty windy all the way up to the Brooks Range and the Arctic coast up here. Probably seen some gale force winds over the Chukchi Sea, and gale force winds and rain pushing into the panhandle there with storm force winds ahead of the front. And for the coastal water forecast for tomorrow, for the south coast of the panhandle, we're looking at small craft advisories for northwest winds at 30 knots. Central coast west winds 20 to 25 knots. Lighter as you go north here, and all the way down to variable at 5 to 10 for the north coast there, with seas anywhere from 9 to 13 feet. Inside waters, Stevens Passage, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, northern inner channels looking at northwest winds at 10 knots. Northwest 20 for Clarence Strait. And then those winds swing around out of the south for Clarence Strait and increase to 30 knots there for the afternoon on Tuesday. Stevens Passage, Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, southeast winds 30 knots with higher gusts. And we're looking at southwest winds 40 knots for the south coast. Good gales out of the south at 45 knots for the central coast, and the north coast here, east to southeast winds 40 to 55 knots. And for Cook Inlet tomorrow, west to south winds 10 to 20 knots, west winds 25 knots, Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands. East at 15 for the Prince William Sound area, western North Gulf Coast, northwest at 20, variable winds 10 to 15 for the east side. And then big increase in the winds here. Prince William Sound, storm warnings in the forecast. East at 50 knots, seas 13 feet. Storm warnings for all of the North Gulf Coast for 50 to 55 knot winds. South 55 knots for the Barren Islands. Southeast at 55 for Kamishak Bay. Very strong winds here in southern Cook Inlet. East at 45 knots there with 11-foot seas. And pretty brisk for the northern inlet there. Out of the northeast at 30 knots. Kodiak Island tomorrow, we've got southeast winds 25 knots, east winds at 45 knots for Bristol Bay, flat out storm warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, east to southeast winds 50 knots with seas up to 15 feet. And then for Tuesday, Kodiak Island, gale warnings, south winds 35 knots, southeast at 35 for Bristol Bay. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula for south to southwest winds at 35 to 45 knots with seas running 7 to 20 feet. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, storm warnings, winds 50 to 55 knots. Northwest 35 knot gales for Adak and Atka. Western Aleutians, west-northwest 25 to 35 knots. And then for the day on Tuesday, much lighter winds out here in the west, down to 15 to 25 knots, and Adak and Atka northwesterlies at 30 knots. Good gales continue for the eastern Aleutians, at least down from the storm warnings of for Monday, but still looking at west-northwesterlies 40 to 45 knots. And for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast tomorrow, gale warning southeast 40 knots, east at 20 for the Yukon Delta Coast, and east-southeast winds at 15 knots for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. Pribilof Island, storm warnings, east winds 50 knots, seas 14 feet, northeast of 25 for the northern Bering Sea. And for the Tuesday outlook here, northwest 45 knots for the Pribilof Islands, seas just under 20 feet, north at 40 knots with 14-foot seas for St. Matthew Island, and east-northeast winds 40 knots for the southwest coast, and gale warnings for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, northeast winds 35 knots, seas 8 feet. And we've got small craft advisories for the entire stretch of the Arctic coast tomorrow for east and northeast winds at 25 knots in the Chukchi Sea, east winds at 15 knots. Big increase in those winds coming up for Tuesday. As you can see here, for the Chukchi Sea, northeast winds 20 to 40 knots with seas 7 to 10 feet. And for the central and east, or western and central Arctic coast, east winds at 30 knots with 6-foot seas, and gale warnings for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east winds 35 knots and seas 7 feet.